covered. The dark truth behind Jamal Khashoggi's murder at the Saudi consulate. Hook. Imagine being betrayed, tortured, and left for dead, only to wake up with unimaginable power. What happens when you go from victim to weapon? Join me as we unravel the chilling truth behind Jamal Khashoggi's darkest hours and the shocking transformation that no one saw coming. Stay tuned till the end. You won't believe the power he gains. The air inside the consulate was thick with tension. Jamal Khashoggi stepped through the door. His eyes scanned the room, a sense of unease creeping up his spine. A familiar place. Yet something felt off. The cool, marble floors echoed beneath his steps. The low hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence. He was greeted by a man in a dark suit. His smile seemed forced, too stiff. "Mr. Khashoggi, welcome," the man said. His voice lacked warmth. Jamal nodded, but kept his distance. The door clicked shut behind him. The faint sound of a lock turning. He sat in the waiting area. The seconds dragged. A strange stillness settled over the room. No sounds of passing traffic outside. No voices. Nothing but the flickering light. Jamal's throat felt dry. He checked his watch. Minutes passed. The door to the inner office opened. A man entered, his presence imposing. Jamal rose to his feet. Instinctively, the man gestured for him to sit. The air felt heavier now. The temperature seemed to drop. Something was wrong. Jamal's heart beat faster. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was a trap. The man spoke, his tone sharp. "We need to talk." Jamal nodded, trying to stay calm, but his hands were shaking. The conversation was brief, the words clipped. There was no warmth in the air, only a cold silence. Jamal tried to focus, to make sense of the conversation. Suddenly, the door behind him opened. Footsteps. He didn't turn to look. A man in a white coat entered, carrying something in his hands. A syringe. Jamal froze. His breath caught in his throat. The man in the dark suit stood up. His eyes locked onto Jamal's. "Stay calm," he said, but the words had no comfort. The syringe was pushed toward his arm. Panic surged through him. The room spun. His vision blurred. A cold sensation spread through his veins. The world around him began to fade. His limbs felt heavy. His breath shallow. A buzzing sound filled his ears. Then nothing, the darkness swallowed him whole. Jamal's body went limp. He couldn't feel his limbs anymore. The cold metal of the chair pressed against his back. His mind was a blur, but somewhere deep within he tried to fight it. But it was too late. The room, once sharp and clear, had become a distant echo. Faces swirled in his vision, but they were shadowed, indistinct. The air smelled sterile, faintly chemical. He was somewhere, but where? What was happening? A low voice pierced the fog in his mind. "Everything's going according to plan." Jamal's eyelids fluttered, but he couldn't open them. The voice was too close now, almost like a whisper in his ear. The words, cruel in their calmness. A soft footfall. A whisper of fabric brushing against the floor. The man in the white coat. The faintest touch of a needle on his wrist. A quick stab and then pressure. A pulse beneath his skin. The door to the room opened again. More footsteps. Jamal couldn't move. His head felt heavy, as if it were made of stone. He could hear muffled voices, fragments of their conversation, slipping through the haze. "We need to dispose of the evidence. Make sure there's no trace. We don't want anything linking us back." A chill ran down Jamal's spine. The truth was dawning on him. He had been betrayed. His trust had been shattered in that instant. He had walked into this place, unaware that it would be his last step. The door slammed shut. The finality of it was suffocating. His breath slowed, but he could still hear them, still feel their presence. The coldness of the room, the sharp tang of fear in the air. Jamal's mind raced for a way out, but his body was frozen. Everything was slipping away. Another voice. Prepare him. Then nothing but the silence that stretched like an eternity. The silence was deafening. Jamal's heartbeat thudded in his chest, slow and heavy. He tried to focus, to gather his senses, but it was as if the world around him had dissolved. His mind screamed, but his body couldn't respond. The darkness tugged at the edges of his consciousness. He felt hands on him, lifting him, dragging him. The sensation was numb, distant. A cold floor beneath his feet, shuffling, shadows moving in and out of view. Move him. The voice was sharp. Jamal could barely hear it, the words muffled. Then another sound, faint but clear, the scrape of metal against stone. Jamal's head lolled to the side. He saw flashes of light, bright, blinding, then dark again. The air smelled of chemicals of death. They were preparing him. But for what? Was this the end? The pressure on his body increased. He could feel them moving him again, the urgency in their actions. The floor beneath his feet became softer, less stable. The scent of wet earth filled his nostrils. Jamal's mind was still a blur, but he understood one thing now. He was no longer in control. His fate had been sealed in the sterile cold of that room. A final struggle, a fight to stay awake, to resist. But the darkness overwhelmed him again. Then a sound. A door creaking open. The noise of footsteps, muffled by the weight of the moment. Jamal's senses faded, and the world became a distant hum. Nothing but the sound of his own breathing, shallow and faint. The last thing he felt was the cold earth. The ground beneath him was solid now. He had no strength left to fight it. The world disappeared, and with it, the chance for truth. The world was silent now. Jamal's body lay still, a heavy weight in the dirt. The coldness of the earth pressed against his skin. The air smelled damp, musty, and thick with the scent of decay. There were no voices now, no footsteps, only the distant hum of the city, faint and far away, the sound of life moving on, unaware. Jamal's eyes were still closed, but his mind was struggling to cling to consciousness. A murmur of voices in the distance, growing louder. We need to cover this up. The words cut through the fog in his mind. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, but he heard them, and his heart, though slow, still beat with dread. His body was being moved again. He felt the tug of hands lifting him, shifting his position. They were placing him somewhere, but where? The coldness was gone now. The air was warm, almost stifling, and yet his skin felt clammy. A tremor ran through him, his senses flickering in and out. Then the unmistakable sound of metal scraping again, the finality of it. Jamal's breath hitched in the dark recesses of his mind. They were burying him. The earth, heavy and unforgiving, closed in around him, layer after layer. The voices were fading, but there was a strange echo in his mind, a feeling that this wasn't the end. Not yet. The world above him continued, unaware of the truth buried beneath. The weight of the earth pressed harder now. Jamal's body was consumed by darkness, but a part of him lingered in the quiet, a pulse in his chest, faint but present. The muffled sounds of the world above seemed distant, unreal. But inside his mind, there was a storm. Thoughts jumbled together, frantic, desperate for clarity. Why had they done it? What had they wanted from him? Jamal tried to focus, tried to move, but the numbness in his limbs was overpowering. Somewhere, in the depths of his mind, he felt a shift, a quiet whisper, a voice that didn't belong. Not yet. The voice was soft, but it carried an urgency that shook him. Jamal's heart fluttered, a spark of awareness flickering. His eyes remained closed, but something stirred within him, a desire to rise, to break free from the suffocating darkness. The earth felt like it was closing in around him, but a small part of him refused to surrender. The voice was still there, faint, persistent. It was telling him something he couldn't fully grasp. A promise? A warning? The feeling of being trapped deepened, but so did the pull to fight, to make them hear him. He was fading again, but not without a final thought, not without a piece of his will remaining. Then there was a sound, a distant rumble, a shift in the air. The world above him seemed to tremble, and for just a moment, the silence was broken. The rumble grew louder. The earth above him shifted, like something was stirring beneath the surface. Jamal's mind seized on the sound. It felt like a tremor, a crack in the world around him. His breath was shallow, but he could feel the pulse of something more, something in the air, a vibration almost like a warning. The earth above him shifted again. He wasn't sure if it was real or just in his mind. Then a crack, a sharp, splintering noise. Something gave way. His senses flared to life. His body, though still heavy, tensed as if responding to the danger. The ground moved, a shifting mass, like the world was about to break open. Was it them? Had they come back? No, it was something else. The earth above him cracked again, louder this time, a faint rush of air, as though the air itself was being torn apart. Jamal's heart raced faster. Was this his chance? A thin sliver of light pierced through the darkness. He wasn't sure if it was real, but it felt like a lifeline. The earth above him stirred, and a strange, desperate force seemed to move through him. His body ached, but his mind fought against the fog. The light grew brighter, cutting through the blackness. The ground shifted again, and this time it wasn't the earth. It was something else, something trying to find him. He wasn't alone. Someone or something was reaching for him. A hand, a grasp, fingers breaking through the dirt. Was it a rescue? Or was it another trap? Jamal could hardly breathe, but he could feel the pull of something beyond him. The sensation of being watched, of being found. He didn't know if he had the strength to resist, but whatever it was drawing closer. Closer still, the hand reached deeper. Fingers scraped against his skin. Rough, cold. Jamal's pulse hammered in his throat. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, but the hand wasn't pulling him out. No, it was pressing him further down. The dirt shifted once more, packing over him like a heavy weight. Panic surged, a violent, choking fear. He was being buried again. But this time, the earth felt different. Not as solid, not as cold. The hand gripped tighter. A cold sensation spread through his chest. An unnatural chill that stopped his heart. He tried to scream, but nothing came. The darkness consumed him once more. But there was a sharp, electric sting at the edges of his mind. A new presence. Louder, closer. Jamal's mind reeled. What was happening? Who was this? Was this the end or another trick? The pressure on his chest loosened, just slightly, but only enough for his lungs to seize in shallow breaths. The ground was still heavy, still suffocating. Then another voice, low, guttural. We need to move him fast. The grip on his arm tightened, and suddenly he was yanked upward, his body jerking violently. He couldn't process it. His eyes still remained closed. The world around him was spinning, the feeling of cold metal against his skin, the roughness of hands, the hurried whispers. Jamal was pulled to his feet, weakly, barely able to stand. His legs trembled. His mind scrambled for clarity. Everything felt unreal. They were dragging him now, not out of the grave, but through something darker, something far worse. Keep him quiet. The voice was harsh, filled with urgency. Jamal's body was limp, his mind slipping. But then A flicker of recognition, a fleeting thought. There was something wrong here. This wasn't rescue. It was something worse. The cold grip on his arm tightened again. Jamal's feet dragged, his body a puppet with no strings. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of oil and metal. His senses, dulled by pain, began to sharpen. He could feel the sharp edges of something hard beneath his palms. The sound of shoes scraping against concrete. No longer earth. He was being moved through a tunnel, its walls narrow, stifling. The flickering light from overhead barely illuminated the path ahead. Each step felt like it was pulling him farther from everything he knew. There was a quiet buzz in the air, an electronic hum that made his skin crawl. His body still refused to respond, but his mind was awake, alive with terror. They're taking him somewhere he couldn't see, but he could feel the cold metal doors waiting ahead. The voices around him were muffled, but the words were clear. Get him into position. Now, the urgency in their tone made his blood run cold. His limbs felt like dead weight, but they were forcing him forward. Then a sharp, sudden pain in his side. A needle plunged into his flesh. The familiar sting of something cold, something unfamiliar, coursing through his veins. Jamal's mind swirled with confusion. He could barely stay awake. The light above him flickered one last time, before everything turned dark. A door slid open with a hiss. The sound of movement, sharp and fast. He was no longer being dragged. Now he was being pushed into a room, its walls lined with cold, harsh light. Jamal's vision blurred. A sudden clarity hit him, but it was too late. He saw faces, not the ones he knew. Strangers, people who had been waiting for him. They surrounded him now, their eyes cold and calculating. He's awake, a voice from behind him, low and menacing. Jamal wanted to fight, to scream, to run, but his body betrayed him. It refused to move. He was trapped, completely, utterly trapped, and the terror that had been gnawing at him, the truth of it, finally began to sink in. The cold air in the room sliced through him, as if it were cutting into his very soul. Jamal's eyes flickered open again, just for a moment, but everything was spinning. The faces around him were blurred, but their intentions were clear. They were circling him, like vultures closing in on their prey. He felt the cold metal against his skin. Chains. They had chained him to something. He couldn't tell if it was a table or a chair, but it didn't matter. He was trapped. Completely trapped. One of the men stepped forward, his face sharp and angular, eyes dark as a storm. He didn't speak at first, just stared at Jamal. The silence was deafening, a heavy, suffocating silence. Jamal's heart raced, but his body didn't respond. The drugs coursing through him made everything feel distant, disconnected. The man's lips parted slowly. Do you know why you're here? Jamal's mind struggled to focus on the words. They were not what he had imagined. This wasn't an interrogation. This wasn't even a conversation. It was a final judgment. He tried to speak, to form words, but his mouth felt dry, his tongue thick and useless. The man smiled. It was a cruel, cold smile. Your silence speaks louder than anything else. Another man moved into view, carrying something heavy in his hands, a device, large and menacing, its dark steel reflecting the harsh light. Jamal's mind screamed for him to escape, but his body was frozen, paralyzed. The men moved quickly, placing the device in front of him. A low hum began to vibrate through the air, louder and louder. The room seemed to close in around him. He could smell the staleness of their breath, the sweat on their skin, the metallic tang of fear. But it wasn't his fear that filled the room. It was theirs. They were afraid of him, afraid of what he knew. and they would do anything to silence him. The hum of the device grew louder, filling the room with an almost physical pressure. Jamal's head pounded, his thoughts scattered like broken shards of glass. His heart hammered in his chest, but he could barely feel it anymore. He was slipping away from everything that had once been real. The man with the device leaned in closer, his breath heavy and thick. Jamal could see the faintest glint in his eyes, a mixture of determination and fear. But mostly there was something darker, something far more dangerous. They were going to silence him completely. "Last chance, Khashoggi," the man said, his voice low and taunting. "Tell us what we want to know." Jamal's mind screamed. He wanted to fight, to shout, but his mouth wouldn't obey. The drugs coursing through his veins had made sure of that. The man smirked, his fingers grazing over the device. Jamal's eyes widened. He understood now. It wasn't a tool of interrogation. It was a tool of erasure. A flick of a switch, and the room was filled with a sudden, searing light. Jamal could feel it inside him, a burning, suffocating sensation, a scream that never left his lips. The light was hot, and the hum turned into a roar. His body trembled, struggling against the invisible force. The device was eating away at his very essence, his mind, his thoughts, his soul itself. It was like drowning, but worse. The air was thick, and he couldn't breathe. He couldn't escape. The men around him watched, their faces blank, their eyes devoid of anything human. They were watching him break apart, and then everything went white. The roar of the device, the crushing pressure, everything vanished. The world fell silent for a moment. There was nothing but white, a blinding, suffocating blankness. Jamal's body felt weightless, as if he were suspended in a void, untouched by time or space. His mind drifted, but it wasn't his mind anymore. It was a collection of fragments, disconnected, scattered. His thoughts were like echoes, fading away, lost in the vast emptiness. Then a flicker, a faint pulse in the distance. Jamal's heart, his consciousness, began to fight its way back. The white light began to fracture, cracking apart like shattered glass. A dark shape loomed on the horizon, slowly coming into focus. A voice, a whisper, faint but familiar. Jamal, it called to him. It pierced through the darkness. He tried to reach for it, but his limbs were heavy, unresponsive. The voice came again, louder this time, urgent. "Jamal, you're not done." The ground beneath him shifted. He could feel the pull of something that wasn't just his body, but his very soul, grappling for the surface. The light that had consumed him started to fade, replaced by a dull, fading glow. Jamal could see shapes now, figures, shadows moving in and out of view. The voices around him grew clearer, but they were distorted, warped by the distance between them. They were saying something, but he couldn't understand. Jamal's eyes flickered open again, but everything was blurred. His mind was heavy, clouded by the memories of what had just happened. The device, the pain. He could feel the weight of his body now, but it felt different, foreign. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. "Not yet," the voice whispered again. It sounded like it was coming from deep within him, and then it hit him. He wasn't alone. He was never alone. The light dimmed further, and Jamal realized that he hadn't just been erased. He had been changed. The realization hit him like a jolt of ice-cold water. He wasn't just alive. He was something else. Jamal's thoughts felt fractured, a patchwork of his own memories and new ones, faint, distant, twisted. The shadows around him moved in ways that weren't natural, like they knew something he didn't. His fingers twitched. He could feel them, but they weren't his. Not entirely. They felt different. Jamal struggled to lift his head, his vision still blurred. But there was something else now, a heightened awareness. He could sense things, hear things, feel the pulse of the world around him in ways he never could before. The air was thick, vibrating with energy. He could feel the walls, the floor beneath him, the very fabric of reality bending in subtle, unnerving ways. A faint whisper brushed against his ear, so close he could almost touch it. "Awake, Jamal. You're awake now." His chest tightened. He wasn't sure if he should be scared or grateful. Was this a gift? Or had they turned him into something else entirely? A figure appeared before him, emerging from the shadows like a specter. The man was tall, his face obscured by a hood, but his eyes gleamed with a strange intensity, as if he could see straight into Jamal's very soul. "You should have stayed silent," the man said, his voice low and cold. "Now you're part of something bigger, something far beyond your understanding." Jamal tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and no sound came out. The man chuckled softly, a sound that made Jamal's skin crawl. "Don't bother trying to fight it. You were always going to be ours." The words echoed in Jamal's mind, pounding like a drum. He wasn't sure if they were real, or if they were just another part of this strange new existence. But the urgency in the man's eyes told him one thing. There was no going back. Jamal had been changed, rewired. He was a part of something much darker than he ever imagined. The room felt smaller now, the shadows closing in. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body betrayed him. "You can still choose, Jamal," the man whispered. "You can still be the key." The air around him thickened, and with it, the truth settled in. The device hadn't erased him. It had transformed him. He wasn't just alive. He was their weapon. The weight of the man's words hit Jamal like a freight train. He wasn't a victim anymore. He wasn't a prisoner. He was something else, something they had crafted, designed for a purpose he couldn't yet understand. His hands twitched again, and this time he felt the surge of energy beneath his skin. It wasn't muscle, wasn't strength. It was something far more sinister. Jamal's breath quickened. The shadows in the room twisted, stretching out like dark tendrils, almost alive. He could feel them, feel their pull. It was as if the very darkness in the room was waiting for his command. The man's voice broke through the growing confusion. "You're connected now. To us. To them." His hand reached out, and with a single motion, the air seemed to vibrate. Jamal felt his entire body resonate with it, a hum deep in his chest. His eyes widened. He couldn't control it. The force, this power, was coursing through him. It was a fire that burned from within, but it was a fire that he could not tame. The man took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to be afraid, Jamal. You'll learn to wield it. You'll learn to command it." Jamal's mind raced, but his body felt like it belonged to someone else. Something ancient and dark was taking root inside him. He could feel it, like a shadow wrapped around his very soul, whispering its commands. His thoughts spiraled. What had they done to him? What was he now? The man seemed to read his thoughts, his lips curling into a thin, knowing smile. "You were always destined to play a part in this. You just didn't know it yet." Jamal's chest tightened with panic. He wanted to fight back, to reject whatever this was, but he could feel the chains that bound him. Not just physical chains, something deeper. His mind screamed for him to escape, to break free, but the more he resisted, the more the power inside him twisted, pulling him toward the man, toward the shadows that danced on the walls. "You are ours now, Jamal," the man said, "and there is no escape from what's to come." Jamal's breath caught in his throat. He was trapped. But it wasn't just his body that was imprisoned. It was his very soul. And with that realization, he understood. There was no going back. This was his new reality. The darkness in the room deepened, and Jamal felt it. He wasn't the one in control anymore. The room seemed to close in on him, its walls pressing in tighter, as if the very space was constricting. Jamal could feel the power within him, pulsing, surging. It wasn't just in his veins anymore. It was his very essence. The shadows whispered in languages he didn't understand, their voices low and dangerous. They wrapped around him like a second skin, slithering through his thoughts. Jamal could hear their demands, feel their pull. "Obey," they murmured. "Join us." His chest constricted. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. The man in front of him moved closer, his presence like a heavy weight, pressing down on Jamal's shoulders. "You don't have a choice, Khashoggi." The words echoed in his mind, and for the first time, Jamal realized the full horror of his situation. He had been remade, reborn as something twisted, something darker. He tried to push back, to force the power inside him to retreat, but it was like trying to hold back a storm. The more he struggled, the stronger it became. "You'll learn to embrace it," the man continued, his voice a low, soothing hum. "You were always meant for this, to be the vessel, the key." Jamal felt a pulse of something deep inside him, and with it came a vision, a dark, impossible vision. He saw the faces of those who had betrayed him, the men and women who had thought they could control him, use him. But in this vision, he was the one in control. He was the one with power. His fists clenched, and the shadows around him seemed to grow stronger, to answer his call. For the first time since the moment he had been taken, Jamal felt something shift. His eyes burned with a new intensity. He could hear the whispers in his mind, but they no longer filled him with dread. They fueled something darker inside him, something that called to him, urged him forward. The man in front of him seemed to notice the shift. His eyes narrowed, and his hand moved toward the device at his side. "You're not ready," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You don't understand." But before he could finish, Jamal reached out with his mind, grasping the shadows, twisting them with a will he never knew he had. The room trembled, the lights flickered, and for a moment, the power was his. The man staggered back, fear flooding his face for the first time. He didn't know what Jamal had become, didn't understand the force he had just awakened. But Jamal knew. He knew exactly what he was capable of. The darkness had consumed him, but now he was its master. Jamal stood in the center of the room, his body still and calm, but inside he was a storm. The shadows bent to his will, writhing like serpents in the air, responding to the raw power now coursing through him. The man before him, once so confident, took a step back, his eyes widening in disbelief. He had underestimated Jamal. He had thought he was just a pawn, a tool to be used. But now Jamal was something else entirely. He wasn't just alive. He was reborn. "You're not ready for this," the man stammered, his voice shaky, filled with a mixture of fear and anger. "You don't know what you're doing." But Jamal didn't need to know. He didn't need to understand the full scope of it. He could feel the power within him, feel the darkness wrapping around him like a cloak. But it was no longer a prison. It was a weapon. His eyes burned with an unnatural intensity. Every nerve in his body hummed with energy, pulsing with a force he hadn't asked for, but would no longer deny. "You were right about one thing," Jamal said, his voice cold, controlled. "You never gave me a choice, but now I make the choices." The room trembled as the shadows thickened, swirling around him, obeying his command. The man's face twisted in fear, his hand trembling as he reached for something at his side. But it was too late. With a flick of Jamal's wrist, the shadows surged forward, crushing the man's hand with a force that felt like thunder. The device fell to the floor with a sharp clatter. Useless now. Jamal took a step forward, his gaze fixed on the man, who was now on his knees, shaking. "You thought you controlled me," Jamal said softly, his words laced with power. "But now I control everything." The man opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He was powerless, a mere shadow of the man he had once been. Jamal turned away, the darkness swirling at his heels. He was done being used, done being silenced. The world outside was waiting. But Jamal was no longer a man bound by rules. He was something far more dangerous. And nothing would stand in his way. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the soft hum of energy in the air. Jamal stood tall, his body alive with power, his mind clear in a way it had never been before. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, but it no longer terrified him, no longer made him small. He was no longer the man who had walked into that consulate, naive, unaware of the forces at play. The shadows at his feet flickered, as if they, too, were waiting for him to decide, to choose what came next. The man who had once tried to control him lay crumpled at his feet, his defiance crushed, his fear palpable in the air. Jamal didn't need to look at him to know he was finished. He had made his choice. Jamal turned toward the door, his gaze steady, his steps deliberate. The world beyond that room was waiting for him, but it was a world he had to reshape, a world that wouldn't recognize him when he was done. The shadows followed him like old friends, creeping along the walls, the floor, ready to be wielded at his command. For the first time in his life, he was free. As he stepped out into the corridor, the weight of the night lifted. No longer was he a tool to be used, a pawn in someone else's game. He was the player now, and he would rewrite the rules. But something inside him stirred, a flicker of doubt. Had he truly escaped, or had he simply traded one cage for another? He paused at the doorway, his hand resting on the frame, his thoughts racing. But in that moment, he realized the answer didn't matter. He had made his choice, and he would see it through. The door clicked shut behind him, and the darkness enveloped him completely. This was his world now, and he was its master.